I used to think our marriage was solid simply because it was quiet. We didn't fight much. We paid bills on time, ate dinner together most nights, slept in the same bed. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it felt like living beside someone rather than with him. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was careful, like we were both afraid that saying the wrong thing would expose how far apart we'd grown. We had been married long enough to stop asking questions that mattered. He stopped asking how my day felt and limited himself to how it went. I stopped telling him what I needed because I didn't want to sound needy or ungrateful. Love became routine, and routine became an excuse for not trying. I told myself this was normal, that passion naturally fades, that comfort was enough. But comfort without closeness starts to feel like loneliness. You're not allowed to complain about why husband was attentive in practical ways. He remembered appointments, fixed things around the house, and never forgot an anniversary. Emotionally, though, he stayed just out of reach. When I looked at him, I often felt like he was observing me instead of seeing me. His eyes lingered in moments when I expected warmth, but there was something unreadable there. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own restlessness onto him. I didn't wake up one day wanting to cross boundaries. It happened slowly, through unmet needs and unanswered conversations. I missed being desired in a way that felt alive, not scheduled or expected. I missed being surprised. When you go too long feeling invisible, even the idea of attention starts to feel intoxicating. That scared me, but I didn't know how to admit it without sounding like I was blaming him for my unhappiness. There were moments when I almost spoke up. Late at night, when the house was quiet and honesty felt possible, I would rehearse the words in my head. I wanted to say I felt lonely even though I wasn't alone. I wanted to ask him if he still wanted me or if we were just coexisting out of habit. Every time I swallowed those words, he seemed calm, steady, unbothered. I didn't want to be the one to disturb that balance. Looking back, I see how naive that was. Silence doesn't preserve a marriage. It only delays the truth. I thought avoiding conflict meant avoiding damage. What I didn't realize was that the damage was already there, growing quietly in the spaces we refused to fill. I convinced myself that as long as neither of us crossed a clear line, we were safe. That was before I understood that some lines aren't crossed in secret but shifted in plain sight. Before I knew that watching, wanting, and withholding could change everything without anyone touching at all. At that point, I still believed I knew my husband completely. I still believed the rules of our marriage were clear. And I had no idea how close we were to rewriting them. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening, which somehow made it worse. There was no argument leading up to it, no dramatic build-up. We were sitting across from each other, the day already winding down, when he said my name in a way that told me this wasn't small talk. His voice was steady, almost careful, as if he'd practiced what he was about to say. That alone made my stomach tighten. He told me he needed to be honest, that carrying something alone had started to feel heavier than the risk of telling me. I remember bracing myself for the usual fears. An affair, a confession, an apology I wasn't ready to hear. What he said instead confused me before it hurt me. He spoke about watching, about observing moments that weren't meant for him, about how it made him feel closer and farther at the same time. He didn't sound ashamed. He sounded analytical, like he was explaining a thought experiment rather than exposing something that could break us. I asked him to explain. And he did, slowly, choosing his words like they could protect us from their meaning. He insisted he hadn't acted, hadn't crossed what he considered a real line. To him, distance made it acceptable. To me, distance didn't soften the betrayal. It sharpened it. I felt exposed without having done anything yet, as if my autonomy had already been compromised just by his desire to watch. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. I kept thinking there had to be more, that this couldn't be the whole truth. When I asked him why he was telling me now, he said he didn't want secrets between us anymore. He said he trusted me enough to be honest. That word, trusted, felt misplaced. Trust was the very thing cracking in that moment. Then came the part that changed everything. He didn't just confess, he asked. He framed it as a way to reconnect, a way to bring honesty back into a marriage that had gone quiet. He said boundaries could be agreed upon, that nothing would happen without my consent. He spoke calmly, logically, as if emotions could be negotiated if the terms were clear enough. Listening to him, I felt torn between wanting to protect myself and wanting to save what we still had. I told myself agreeing didn't mean I was weak. I told myself I was being open-minded, that marriage sometimes requires uncomfortable compromises. Deep down, though, I knew fear was guiding me more than trust. I was afraid that saying no would push him further away, that refusing would confirm how distant we'd become. So I nodded when I should have paused. I asked questions instead of drawing a line. With every word, the ground under our marriage shifted. What unsettled me most wasn't the request itself, but how composed he was while making it. I was unraveling internally, questioning my worth, my boundaries, my role in all of this. He, on the other hand, seemed relieved, like saying it out loud had lifted a burden. That imbalance stayed with me long after the conversation ended. That night, lying awake beside him, I realized something had changed irreversibly. Nothing had happened yet, but something had already been taken. The safety I felt in being seen only by him was gone, replaced by the awareness that being watched could exist without closeness. I had agreed to something I didn't fully understand, believing honesty alone could protect us. I didn't know then that permission can be just as dangerous as secrecy. I thought once the truth was out, things would feel clearer. Instead, everything became heavier. I became hyper-aware of myself in ways I never had before. Every choice felt examined, every moment filtered through the knowledge that my husband was no longer just my partner, but an observer standing slightly apart. He reassured me with words, told me we were still a team, but reassurance doesn't erase discomfort when it's rooted in imbalance. What surprised me was how quickly the dynamic shifted. I was the one questioning, overthinking, replaying conversations in my head. He was calm, almost energized, as if naming his desire had given him clarity while it stripped mine away. I started noticing how often he withdrew emotionally, how conversations ended before they reached anything real. He listened less and watched more. And the difference was subtle but unmistakable. That I tried to convince myself I was still in control because I had agreed. Consent, I told myself, meant power. But consent given out of fear isn't freedom. It's self-preservation disguised as choice. The more I tried to be okay with everything, the more I felt myself shrinking. I stopped sharing certain thoughts, stopped expressing discomfort, because I didn't want to seem inconsistent or weak. I had already said yes once. Saying no later felt complicated. Then came the realization that broke something open inside me. I started sensing a new distance, one that wasn't about us anymore. He guarded his phone more carefully. His attention drifted during conversations. When I asked him what was on his mind, he said nothing, or work or stress. Familiar excuses, but they landed differently now. I recognized the signs because I was living them too. Emotional secrecy has a tone, and I could hear it clearly. One evening, without planning to, I asked him a question that surprised us both. I asked if he was still only watching. He didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than any confession could have. When he finally spoke, he didn't deny it outright. He spoke in generalities about curiosity, about how lines blur when you stare at them long enough. He said nothing concrete, but I felt the truth settle in my chest. That was the moment the balance tipped completely. I realized I had carried the weight of discomfort to protect our marriage while he had used honesty as a stepping stone, not a boundary. I wasn't angry in the way I expected. I felt clear. Clear about how unequal things had become. Clear about how watching had turned into wanting, and wanting into something he no longer felt the need to share fully. For the first time since that initial conversation, I stopped trying to manage his feelings. I let myself feel my own without filtering them for his comfort. I noticed how strong I'd become just by surviving the uncertainty, how aware I was of my own needs after ignoring them for so long. I also noticed how much he avoided meeting my eyes now, how observation had replaced connection entirely. It dawned on me that the power I thought I had lost wasn't gone. It had just changed form. I understood something then that I hadn't before. Being watched only works when one person is willing to remain visible, while the other stays hidden. And I was done being the only one exposed. That understanding didn't fix anything immediately. It didn't end the marriage or save it. But it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: agency. I began to see that if watching had rewritten the rules once, they could be rewritten again. And this time I wouldn't be the only one standing in the light. I didn't announce the change when it happened. There was no confrontation, no dramatic declaration. I simply stopped protecting him from the discomfort he had normalized for me. I paid closer attention not out of suspicion at first but out of awareness. When you stop explaining someone's behavior to yourself, patterns become impossible to ignore. I noticed how he grew tense when certain names came up, how his stories became vague, how his calm now felt rehearsed instead of natural. What struck me most was how familiar it all felt. The secrecy, the careful wording, the emotional distance disguised as thoughtfulness. I realized he was now living inside the same quiet anxiety I had carried for so long. The difference was that he didn't know I could see it. And for the first time I understood what he must have felt before. Powerless in action but powerful in knowledge. Watching him didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel steady, detached in a way that allowed clarity instead of fear. I didn't rush to expose anything or demand explanations. I let the truth reveal itself slowly. Because that's how it always does when someone believes they're unseen. The irony wasn't lost on me. The dynamic he had once framed as harmless curiosity now weighed on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Eventually, the roles reversed without either of us naming it. He became more anxious, more attentive, trying to read my reactions the way I used to read his. I became quieter, not because I was withdrawing, but because I no longer needed to chase reassurance. When he asked if something was wrong, I gave him the same vague answers he once gave me. Not out of spite, but out of honesty. I wasn't ready to explain myself until I fully understood what I wanted. The moment of truth came not through discovery, but through exhaustion. He sat across from me one night and asked if I was still okay with everything we had agreed to. There was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. I realized then that watching changes you no matter which side you're on. I told him the truth, calmly and without accusation. I told him I had been watching too. Not in the way he meant, but in the way that matters most. Watching his choices. Watching how easily boundaries shift when only one person carries the weight of them. That conversation didn't end our marriage, but it ended the illusion we had been living under. There were consequences, not dramatic ones, but real ones. Trust didn't snap back into place. It had to be rebuilt or released. We both had to face the fact that intimacy without mutual vulnerability becomes control, even when it's wrapped in honesty. Looking back, I understand why the title of my story sounds like revenge. But it wasn't about punishment. It was about balance. About realizing that visibility should never be one-sided. Watching taught me something I had forgotten, that my silence had been mistaken for acceptance, and my fear mistaken for consent. I don't tell this story to justify what either of us did. I tell it because marriages don't break all at once. They fracture slowly, through unspoken agreements and quiet compromises. The moment I stopped being afraid to see clearly was the moment I stopped being powerless. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is open your eyes, even when you don't like what you're going to see.